Hello and welcome. Today we're pleased to kick off the second session of a communion of subjects, law, environment, and religion. My name is Andrew Doss. I'm an attorney, the founding director of a law and policy initiative called the Global Catastrophe Center, and a first-year student at Yale Divinity School. I'll be facilitating the session along with my partner, Dena.
Hi, I'm Dena Adler. I'm a second-year student pursuing a joint degree at Yale Law School and Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. And we're absolutely delighted to have Linda Sheehan with us today. Linda is the executive director of the Earth Law Center, where she works to develop innovative laws and governance models that help recognize the inherent rights of nature to thrive, exist, and evolve. She also has over 20 years of experience in environmental law and policy. She's developed courses on earth rights for Vermont Law School, the California Institute for Integral Studies, and other institutions, and has been recognized as a California coastal hero for her great work protecting California's waterways, oceans, and coasts. So I'm really grateful to have you here today. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a real privilege to be here.
Thank you.
So to kick us off, the first thing we were hoping you could talk a little bit more about is defining rights of nature for those unfamiliar and why it's such a pivotal model, and perhaps using kind of the framework of your career and how your thinking about how to fix environmental law has evolved over time and come to a place where you see rights of nature as an important tool.
Well, that's a great question, and feel free to cut me off if I explain a little too long. But my experience, as you mentioned, has been more in the traditional environmental advocacy field, doing work for nonprofits for a number of years, and before that, doing environmental compliance work for a law firm. And so my experience and my education all led me in a certain path with regard to how to think about the environment and how to think about the natural world and how to regulate it. And so what we did in, my colleagues and I over the years is to take your traditional environmental laws, your Clean Water Act, your Porter Cologne Water Quality Control Act, your other Magnuson-Stevens, and try to implement them as best we can, and really try to, there's such smart people, working in California, try to push the envelope, try to litigate, try to get more enforcement mechanisms, try to get more funding, and really see how much we could spread this open and really get some good environmental results. And after a while, you do get better at this. You tend to learn more, you tend to learn how the system works, the regulatory system. But for myself, for me, after I did this for quite a while and got as adept at it as generally was accepted, I found that we were winning battles but losing the war. We were losing our salmon runs, we were losing our waterways, pollution was still a problem. And so I started to think about, well, what if it's not our advocacy, it's not the great work that's being done by advocates, what is it? And after some reflection, and perhaps this is another question that we could talk about more later, which I'm happy to do, the answer started to come that it's not the advocacy, it's not the work, it's how it's structured, it's how we look at the environment, it's how we look at the natural world. And we think of the natural world as something that's separate from us, something that's distinct, that we can buy and sell and trade and own. And we try to protect it in part because if we don't, we're hurting ourselves. But we're not thinking about how we are thinking about it in the wrong way, how we're thinking about it as separate, how we're thinking about it as external and something that can be manipulated. And where rights of nature comes in is it allows us to be able to bring the natural world into our discourse, into how we govern. We talk about managing nature, managing the environment, but we really need to manage ourselves. And part of the problem is we have this very circumscribed way of looking at our place in the world as just us, just humans. And we need to, like Aldo Leopold talked about, we need to expand that to include the natural world. And rights of nature is a way to begin that discussion. If we talk about human rights, people know what that is. But when we say nature has fundamental rights as well, that also arise from the fact that nature is part of the earth, then we start to go, well, that doesn't make sense. And then you start to think, well, why doesn't that make sense? Then the question, the query, the discussion begins. And we can start to think about how to expand our circle, how to expand our awareness, and how to expand our laws to include the natural world.
Would it be accurate to describe from what you're saying that part of where that new framework of thinking, part of what that introduces is not only endowing nature with rights, but endowing humans with corresponding obligations or responsibilities?
Yes, although I would say we're not endowing nature with rights
Okay,
because
good,
nature
yeah.
already has these fundamental rights. So, not to nitpick, but it's important to think, the natural world has its own rights that arise from its existence. And yes, it absolutely incurs obligations on us. And that's part of what we've forgotten, that we try to think about what we can get from nature and how we can use nature in a more efficient way. And we forget that we have obligations that arise from our relationship with nature. And until we start to think about our relationship with nature, with the natural world, with our place in this larger system, in the larger planet, then we forget about our obligations, because we have to have that back and forth. Just as in your own family, your own living situation, you have relationships with the people that you live with, and you have obligations to behave in a certain way in your relationship, in your living space. This is a larger living space, and we have to recognize our relationship to all of the residents.
Can you describe a little bit more or paint a big picture going through your advocacy work, both in nonprofits and in law firms? Could you describe a little bit of the landscape in very broad strokes that helped you see that there was a gap that this new framework would help fill?
Yeah, I mean, the part of the problem is when you're doing the advocacy work, your language is very limited, and so part of it's a lot of different little pieces that started to fit together just from my own experience. And one of them was looking at just the Clean Water Act, and you hear this refrain from a lot of folks where you say, oh, it's just you get a permit, but it's a license to pollute. It's just a permit to pollute. And you hear that refrain quite a lot, and it's frustrating in implementing, say, the Clean Water Act, because you're like, yeah, it is a licensing to pollute, but what's really wrong with that? And it really starts, once you start to delve into what's really wrong with that, which you start to do when you're realizing your advocacy isn't getting exactly where you want to go, you start to think about the language of this statute and the language of the regulations. And so where the Clean Water Act and these other laws came from in the early 70s was, I think, a very different place from where the implementation ended up. So if you think back to where these laws came from, the late 60s, where you had the Cuyahoga River catching fire and showing around the earth on TV what was going on. You had the Santa Barbara oil spill with oiled birds, and then Lake Erie was contaminated, and so it was dead. And so Silent Spring had come out a few years before that and was talking about DDT. So you had all these very in-your-face type of insults to the earth. And so people, I think, came at the laws and Earth Day in particular with this real sense of obligation, which you talked about before, the sense of moral obligation to the earth, that this is wrong. What we're doing is really wrong. These insults that we're seeing to the earth are wrong, and we need to fix that. And as somebody who grew up and was a small child at that time, I can tell you that really resonated with me, and that's why I wanted to do this advocacy, was because of what was going on. So when we passed these laws, when the Clean Water Act was passed over Richard Nixon's veto, can you imagine doing something like that nowadays? When that was passed over his veto, it said things like, we need to stop pollution, by a certain date. And stop putting pollution, I'm paraphrasing loosely for those of you who know the details of the Clean Water Act, but it sets a high bar, and it came from this sort of moral connection that we had because of these water insults. But then when you look at the regulations, and this is my frustration, to answer your question, is when you look at the regulations, that's when everybody kind of went home. And so the environmental groups, which were growing up at the time, and industry, which was going, gosh, well, I don't know if I like where this is going, got together and advocated, and this new Environmental Protection Agency came out with regulations that said, for example, you don't have to do all that much unless there's a reasonable potential to violate water quality standards. So where you started was this sort of moral outrage that people had, and they cared about the earth. They wanted to do something positive. So the Earth Day, and 20 million people showed up in the streets. And then you ended up with, you don't really have to do too much unless there's a reasonable potential to violate standards. Well, that's just saying, okay, we're going to allow pollution to happen until it's just barely above the point where it's so polluted we don't want to touch it. Or with the Endangered Species Act, we're not going to do anything until there are so few species we could give them names, and just call them by their individual names. So as I started to think about, well, what's really wrong with what I'm doing? why do I feel so frustrated? It's because you're butting up against these limitations and wondering, then you start to question why do these limitations exist when the law was meant to be something else. And that allows you to be able to go off in a different direction and capture that, if we had that moral outrage and we wanted to have a more moral set of laws, what would that look like?
If I can just follow up real briefly, does that, does the structure of the rights of nature framework, does that introduce the possibility of a more prospective, long-term accountability mechanism that you see that would make that more sustainable, whether it's regulatory or through civil liability or anything else?
Well, I think
Or is it more just philosophical?
It's both. It's sort of like whenever you start to recognize that certain people who don't have rights do have rights, then things start to change in ways that perhaps you didn't necessarily expect in some ways that you do. So just women's right to vote. I mean, we had, the way that I think of rights of nature is it's correcting an error. So women were given the right to vote to correct the error that only men had the right to vote. That was a mistake. You may have started out with no right to vote and just everybody assumed, well, of course everybody has, everybody goes vote. Okay, great, we're going to go vote. Why should we say there's a right? But we made a mistake in only giving it to men. So we expanded that to include women. And so now we're doing the same thing. We're using rights of nature not as the end game, but as a way to start to expand the circle of democracy, to include the natural world. And it allows us to have a different conversation. And yes, in the meantime, you're going to be bringing, litigation, you're going to be passing laws, you're going to be changing how you do things because this is what we have to do. And that's going to be that's going to be tough, it's going to be hard, it's going to be a lot of friction. But that's the only way to get through to the other side. And the other side is where we want to be, which is this life that is in harmony with this idea that we are actually integrated with part of the earth. Yeah.
So picking up this thread of rights and responsibilities, one area where the class was really interested in delving into this was climate change. Mm-hmm. So in an era of climate change, it's very difficult to say what is natural and also what obligations humans might have to maintain what is natural. So for example, we talked about pikas and how these cute little cousin of the rabbit are literally running out of mountain as temperatures rise. Is there a right of nature for the pika to be relocated due to man-made climate change, or a corresponding obligation of humans to relocate?
Well, yes and no. It's your lawyer answer. So, I mean, I think you do need to do what you can to try to correct the errors that you made. I mean, you know how it is when you hurt somebody, in a legal sense or just in everyday sense. You not only have to apologize, you also have to make amends. So you have to feel like, and part of talking about rights of nature is allowing ourselves to feel the enormity of the wrong that we're doing to the earth. And then to try to make amends. And so perhaps for the species that we're harming, we do need to make some amends. We need to try to address the problems that we have. And climate change, I guess I'm sure we're going to follow up on climate change, so I won't touch on that just yet. But that particular example puts me in mind of an example that we have in California where we have some species of fish that are on the endangered species list and are preventing sustainable water management from occurring because we have to pay attention to these endangered species which are kind of getting in the way, as people want to say. So what we're doing is, rather than addressing the core issue that we're taking too much water out of waterways and we're violating the fish right to swim and violating the waterways right to flow, rather than doing that, we're saying, well, how can we manipulate the fish? Could we move them someplace else? Could we just let them go extinct, which some people are talking about? Endangered species triage is the term that people are using. Rather than really addressing the core issue, we address the periphery. And so I think that this example is kind of the periphery. We do need to do some of that, but that's not the core issue. The core issue is fundamentally, how do we reimagine how we live our lives, how we imagine our governance, how we reimagine our economic system, so that does not become a problem. So you deal with that, just as we aren't going to stop, using the Clean Water Act, because there's this larger construct we need to think about. But we need to do both at the same time. We need to use that as an example of how we need to do things better. So that's why I say yes and no. You do need to keep doing that, but you can't get caught up in just doing that because you'll miss all of the things that you need to do. It's sort of like when you have a big deadline and you say, gosh, my desk is messy, and if I fix it, then I'll feel much better. Well, there's always some other thing to do rather than the work at hand. And you have to the desk has to be neat, but you got to do the work at hand.
So digging into that reimagining, one way our class tried to start doing that was we created a little exercise where we pretended that we were in California and we had a river with a limited amount of water. And we tasked folks with representing the big agricultural companies, with municipal governments, with citizens, with advocating for the rights of the ecosystem. And we realized very quickly that when there's a scarce resource, you come into conflict. And it was very difficult to say how much a right of nature was, how much a river's right to flow might be. Was it how much it's always flowed? Does a river have a right to flow in a way that could damage communities, or a right to flow when citizens might need to truck in bottled water in order to leave the water in the river? And I know in your writing, you always talk about human rights and rights of nature as very integrated and mutually beneficial to one another. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how you see human rights and rights of nature interfacing, and especially how to deal at these moments of conflict.
Yeah, and that's a great question, and that's definitely not limited, as you know, to sort of nature's rights and human rights. There are, there's a lot of literature on the question of potentially conflicting human rights. And so I think that what you could do is just bring that literature, bring that analysis into the discussion of how you deal with nature's rights. And what I found, and this question comes up a lot, what I've found in sort of looking at it is the first thing that you need to do, and this is in so the literature as well, is just look and see first, is there a problem? Is there a real conflict? And in many cases, there isn't a real conflict between a fundamental right and a fundamental right. There may be a conflict between a fundamental right and a desire, but not between a fundamental right and a fundamental right. So if somebody in California, what we've been having a lot of problems with lately with water is there have been a lot of, and the Farm Bureau has said this, that there's been a lot of outside investment in almonds in California because they're a high cash crop right now. You can make a lot of money. Almond milk is very popular and other almond products. So a lot of almond trees have been planted and they're very water intensive. So that's been part of the problem in California is we have this high cash crop that's very water intensive, and that's certainly not the only reason that there's a water problem. But you need to start to think about how you take that, which is not really a fundamental right, that's a desire to make money, versus the fundamental right of the river to flow. If they're pulling water from a river, say, to feed an almond orchard, and you're draining the river so it's not a river anymore, you're taking away its inherent existence, you're taking away its life force. Whereas here, you're impacting, what they may view as a property right, but perhaps it's more of a desire. There may be a right to some lesser extent, fundamental right versus, they call priority rights versus secondary rights. Maybe this is a secondary right and this is a priority right. There are different gradations of rights and different gradations of desires versus rights. So it's not necessarily one fundamental right against another. The question of drinking water is one where I think it may get into sort of fundamental right of a community to have drinking water versus the fundamental right of the river to flow. But if they're only getting their drinking water from the river, then you necessarily can't fulfill this one right to the exclusion of this one. So what I would say in a larger sense, to just step back with this question of water, which is incredibly important because water itself is is fundamentally necessary to live, is the same answer that I would have in this, the people who work on human rights conflicts, is you need to look at it, and it sounds like a cop-out, but it's true. You really need to look at it on a case-by-case basis. And there are certain strategies that you can do to do that, but you need to consider what is going on in the particular situation. So if you're looking at it at that level, and you're looking at agriculture, you're looking at municipal, and you're looking at the needs of the rivers, in California, if you did it that way and you looked at it rather than just sort of say, well, nature can't have rights because they all have these water rights, you would see that there's actually plenty of water. It's just how we use it, how we distribute it, how we allocate water rights is antiquated, is to put it politely. It needs an overhaul. And we're in the 4th year of a drought, and we may be in the 4th year of a 10-year drought or the 4th year of a 20-year drought. We don't know. But if we don't start to address how water is allocated in California, we're all going to be the losers. So conflicts among rights is a longer conversation, which I'm happy to talk about. But I think fundamentally it's a false question, because if we're draining the river and taking away its riverness, its essence, then we're taking away its life. And I think that that's a real fundamental violation of rights that would be pretty hard to overcome with a human desire.
And I hope maybe you could touch briefly, you mentioned earlier your work in the lead up to the Paris negotiations on climate change, and I know you're also doing work with the Millennium Development Goals in this co-violations of human rights and rights of nature, if you wanted to touch briefly on that work.
Yeah, so what when we started working on nature's rights, people would say, well, what about human rights? Humans have rights as well, and how do you measure, as you say, how do you measure one against the other? And to me, just working with grassroots advocates around the world, because this is inherently a global problem, I was seeing more and more that where you have environmental violations, rights of environments being violated, you almost always have human rights being violated as well. So you may have, especially in the case of mining, you're seeing more and more around the world where, especially in South America, people will come in, corporations will come in and they'll put in a mine and they'll say, oh, don't worry, it's going to have jobs or it's going to benefit the community, and it almost never does. And so you'll see these just really gross violations of the environment's rights, but also at the same time, people who are protesting getting thrown in jail, people getting very, very sick, labor, that is not properly compensated to the point of, essentially slavery. You're seeing this all over the world. And so what I wanted to do is be able to illustrate that it's not humans versus the environment. It's humans and the environment versus this larger construct that we've invented for ourselves. Again, back to the first question about our place in the earth. If we are thinking of the earth as something separate from us, that's something that it's a natural resource that we can feed into our economic system, rather than this incredibly wonderful, cherished, amazing spiritual entity with which we've been privileged to co-evolve, then we are going to be on the wrong path, and we're going to see more and more of these violations happening, because the way that the economic system is set up, it needs to be fed with resources, human resources and natural resources. And it's for that reason that the UN came out with a report a couple years ago where they looked at human rights advocates doing any kind of human rights work around the world, whatever it might be, women's rights, children's rights, whatever it might be. And they found that the number one threatened population of human rights advocates, the most likely to be killed for their advocacy, were human rights defenders of the environment in the Americas, especially South America. So if you're in South America doing human rights advocacy around the environment, a human right to a healthy environment, people trying to prevent a very destructive mine from coming in, you're the most likely to be killed. And the most recent person in that case was a man who was going to be testifying at a Rights of Nature tribunal in Lima in December, speaking of the climate change conference, and he was traveling to get there and never made it, and he was found murdered on the way. So it's unfortunately, on our website we've got a lot of illustrations of these, and it's unfortunately not limited. It's a worldwide problem. So it's this larger system, that's coming home to roost, especially as we use more and more of the earth. There's going to be more and more pressure to get more out of it, and it's just more than it can give.
If I can follow up on a couple of those things. You mentioned the difficulty with water allocation. Mm-hmm. You also mentioned the way that you mentioned endangered species triage. Mm-hmm. It seems we've talked in very broad terms. I'm going to push a little bit on the nitty-gritty because our class was trying to grapple with what some of the consequences might be down the road in terms of how a rights of nature framework would work. How does it at this point in its development have any sense of how to deal with that allocation question? Or let's take it more specifically, look at where rights might conflict between different species or different parts of nature. Mm-hmm. A perfect example is going back to a case you worked on back in 2005, Ocean Conservancy versus the U.S. EPA. You described it as a historic settlement in which the U.S. EPA agreed for the first time to consider invasive species as pollutants mm-hmm. under the Clean Water Act, which would seem to say that invasive species don't have a right of a natural right in the same way that maybe a species does who's originally in that habitat. Mm-hmm. Could you describe how those might play out?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because I think it was UC Davis just did a really good study about that very question about how you've got different species fighting for water and habitat in one particular area, and how do you start to reconcile that? And that's in part because of the pressure. Invasive species are certainly because of the pressure that we've put on the earth. And I would say that Gosh, you know, there's a number of ways. You asked a number of questions. I'm trying to think of the best way to answer it. In terms of how it plays out, how the rights of nature plays out in sort of the water realm, yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that, you know, I've been thinking about and working with some great work last semester with some great students here at Yale and working with some other great students here at Yale to finish that particular question is to, the question being, if you're going to have a campaign in California specifically around the question of a waterway's right to flow and a fish right to swim. What does that look like? What are the parameters of that? How would you actually accomplish that? What is the law that you would change? How would you redline the water code to make that look different? How would you amend the California Code of Regulations to streamline the permit process so that you could change over water rights permits? How would you streamline the waste and unreasonable use process in the California State Constitution to do that? And how would you determine what the minimum flow is? And that's a science question too. It's a science question and it's also a judgment question, because if you say under rights of nature, a river has a right to flow to be healthy, it's a very different thing from under the water code where it says a river has a right to the amount of water that it needs in order to maintain the beneficial uses that are the ones that we have named to wit, these are these. So it's very different because the river isn't part of our water rights system in California, and I'll get to the second part of your question, don't worry. So the way that water rights are structured in California, you can only get a water right if you divert water out of a waterway for human use. So I could have a water right if I have a farm or I have a house and I need it to water my lawn, or municipalities have water rights, farmers have water rights, but the river has no water rights. So if there's an argument about water rights in California, then the river doesn't have a seat at the table. It's stuck at the card table, you know, at Thanksgiving with the kids, you know. And while the grown-ups decide what's best for it. And that's not the way that it should be. I mean, the river is, you know, the life force. It's what allows us to be able to function, and it needs that respect. So what does that mean? Is that just sort of like, you know, nice talk, or does that actually have hard meaning? And you can make it have hard meaning. Some places have started to have in-stream water rights programs, like Oregon, for example, has in-stream water rights that are water rights held by the state on behalf of the river. And there are, you know, limitations to that, which, you know, we could talk about more if you like, but there are certain gaps in how you are implementing that to limit its effectiveness, and partly because it's coming at it from the perspective of, I care about the river, but I still think of the river as something separate, versus I love and care about the river, it's part of me, I'm going to make sure I take care of the river just as I would take care of me and as just as it takes care of me. So you would structure it differently in the way that we want to structure it in California that, you know, we've been talking about with the different students. Is quite a bit different. And then how you get at this, the second part of your question with regard to species sort of fighting over the same bit of water, and including invasive species. The idea is, you know, what Thomas Berry wrote about, and I'm loosely paraphrasing from the Ecuador Constitution, that species have a right to exist and thrive and evolve. And so, yeah, you know, we played God in the past, you know, introducing invasive species, you know, diking and paving over habitats, draining water. And so, you know, we're playing a little bit of God trying to figure out how do we make this better. And if we're saying that species have a right to exist and thrive and evolve, and invasive species are destroying native species, then you may need to think about how you are going to get a natural system back to the place where it would be most likely to thrive, most likely to evolve. And that's most likely going to involve native plants rather than invasive plants, which are just going to choke everything out. So if you're allocating water among native species, then that's a hard conversation that you need to sit down and have, just as when you're allocating water between people or between people and nature or all of the above. You need to sit down and have a hard conversation, and what that looks like has to be, in a public process, very transparent, very inclusive, because we need to come to these decisions together. But there are certainly ways to be able to do that.
Okay, thanks.
So it seems some of where the rubber hits the road here is how we actually get rights of nature into our policies and then implement those policies. So we have rights of nature in Ecuador, in Pittsburgh, in Santa Monica, thanks to the great work that you've done with Earth Law Center. And I wanted to read a quick excerpt from the Santa Monica Ordinance just to give people a flavor of this language and talk a little bit about that. So whereas in response to the evils of treating the natural world as mere property, the worldwide, national, and local environmental communities are urging governments to adopt a new paradigm based upon recognition that both individual human beings and natural communities or ecosystems have fundamental environmental rights, which should be recognized by the law. that the health of the world's populations and ecosystems depends on the full protection of these rights, and that asserted corporate rights can no longer be allowed to take precedence over these rights to human and environmental health and well-being. So it's really great language. For other law students and lawyers in the room, it's not what you normally see in an ordinance. And I was curious with how happy you've been with the language that you got in there, how well it's been working. Have you been able to deliver results or enforce action based on having this in the ordinance in Santa Monica?
Yeah, no, it is really great language. And the way that the ordinance is structured is, and this is again getting to like the discussion that you need to have in a community when you're passing something like this and thinking about the natural systems that you're trying to protect. The way that it's structured is it protects natural systems, natural communities and ecosystems within the city of Santa Monica. And so those natural because it's an actual city, those natural ecosystems and communities right now include the aquifer that they live are on top of. And there are no free-flowing waterways in Santa Monica. It's a dry area. So the aquifer, the atmosphere, so you can sort of get at greenhouse gas emissions, of course. And then they're on the coast, of course, at Santa Monica, so the nearshore ecosystem as well. And that's, because it's unfortunately paved over, that's kind of it right now in terms of natural systems. But the ordinance is left open, of course, to be able to amend it later to include other systems as we're able to sort of try to bring those back. So the example of the aquifer is something, let me back up for a second. The reason that Santa Monica put this law into place was because they had a sustainable city plan that they wanted to protect. And they were afraid after Citizens United came down that corporations would come in and tell them what to do with their sustainable city plan. They'd say, oh, you have to take hydrofrac gas, or oh, you have to take some sort of unsustainable sourced water, perhaps from a dam, and they wanted to be able to have more locally sourced water. So they wanted to protect the integrity of their sustainable city plan, which is a pretty good plan. So they contacted us so that we could work with them to pass this ordinance, and that's partly why that language is so strong, because the people in Santa Monica are really committed and had a lot of conversations about what a sustainable city looks like to them. So part of the success in this ordinance is they amended their sustainable city plan after this ordinance came out to reflect the rights of nature in their sustainable city plan. So, and they also put that as a standing agenda item for their task force on the environment, which is the one who first introduced the idea of having a rights of nature ordinance. And so they've been working since then to try to figure out sort of how do we move forward to implement this. And so they're first thinking and playing with this idea of climate change, maybe having greenhouse gas emission, really intensive greenhouse gas emission reduction in the city tied with zoning laws, et cetera, that would force a certain direction in climate change, to be able to make a statement about greenhouse gas emissions and climate change changes. And because of the drought, that we're having in California, I mean, it's very difficult to understate what's going on with the drought. It's very difficult for city officials to wrap their heads around it. So they've been sort of like tasked full time on the drought. So now it's kind of shifted to this question of the aquifer. And how do we start to look at the aquifer and whether we are using it in a way that recognizes the aquifer's right to be healthy? Because there is a citizen suit provision in there. You don't want to jump to that right away. So that question right now is being examined in terms of how much water is being taken out, and there's not a lot of good data. So we're trying to figure out how do you get more data on that. How you estimate how much the aquifer, how well it's doing. To date, it's been doing really well. They've got a good plan to get them totally self-sufficient on water by 2020, and they're on track to meet that. But the drought is really hurting everything. But you can't overdrain the aquifer because of that. There's still a lot of conservation that can take place. So that's kind of where we are right now, is that it's really fortunate we have this provision in the law because it does protect the aquifer in a way that California water law absolutely does not. Groundwater management in California is virtually non-existent. And so having this law in place allows us as advocates, and the city cares a lot too, they're pretty good, but allows us as advocates to push even harder on some people in the community that may or may not, necessarily want to come around to this idea of the conservation that's needed. So it provides that tool for people to rally around and have an enforceable way to be able to make sure the aquifer is healthy.
So in having rights of nature as one tool, how do you see it as fitting into the wider toolbox that environmental lawyers and environmental advocates have? Do practices like advocating for carbon taxes or cap and trade support and like complement, or do they kind of undermine the goals that you're trying to set out with changing the paradigm?
Well, I think that the answer to that question gets back to the language that you just read in the ordinance, because it talked about the rights of nature, but it also talked about corporate rights shouldn't usurp the rights of people in the community and the rights of nature in the community. And I think that both of these pieces are essential to remember when we're doing our advocacy. And as environmental advocates, as someone who's been in the environmental community for a number of years, we don't spend enough time as environmental advocates talking about that second piece, talking about corporate personhood, corporate rights, and as a larger construct, this idea of the economic system that we're living under that allows us, again, to keep nature as something that's separate, that we can, reduce into bits and pieces like widgets and buy and sell and trade and market. And until we as environmental advocates get both of those pieces, as the ordinance talks about, both the inherent rights of nature and this idea that corporations should not have the rights of people, let alone nature having no rights at all, and the economic system that we're living within, which generated this idea of corporate personhood. I mean, that is something that we need to start to evolve away from. And I spoke at lunch today and mentioned that there was a quote that I can't attribute. I know Pablo Salón said it, but I know other people have said it as well, that it's really just kind of mind-boggling and shocking to think that we can more readily imagine the end of a healthy earth than we can imagine the end of our capitalist system, our current economic system. And we say, oh, it's terrible with climate change, et cetera, but we don't say, oh, it's terrible, our economic system is generating this. And it absolutely is. So we need to start to think about what a different economic system looks like, and that corporate personhood, corporate rights reference is a call to do that. And I think we have a responsibility as advocates not just to talk about rights of nature and putting that into law, because that by itself isn't enough. We also need to say, this is our positive vision. We are going to recognize our relationship with nature, and we're going to incorporate that into everything we do, but we can't do that without taking away the inhibitors, the blockades, the roadblocks in our way. And that's really this economic system, which fortunately ecological economists have started to articulate other models that we can start to use. So if we combine that with this rights of nature paradigm, we can start to have the beginnings of a new type of governance system, a new way of self-managing to recognize our relationship with the earth.
So it's very exciting to imagine this paradigm, and I think you've beautifully articulated why it's so necessary to switch the paradigm. But I was wondering if you've also felt that there are sometimes costs to advancing an innovative framework, especially in the legal profession, which is based on precedent and tends to be kind of more backwards facing. Mm-hmm. Have you found there to be professional or political costs or pushback on you advancing a rights of nature model?
Yeah, and I'll answer that, but I feel bad because I forgot to answer that last little bit of your question where you were talking about carbon taxes and cap and trade.
Sure.
Yeah, so I apologize. I'll answer that quickly. But to get at this question of the economic system, if what we've tended to do is try to take the natural world, which is being very unruly, from an economic system perspective, and not really fitting into our economic models because it doesn't. But we try to monetize it to make it fit better. And that's what I think cap and trade is, and IFQs, fishing quotas. These types of ways to monetize and trade the environment is our solution to this economic system that is harming the environment. So we're creating a solution out of the problem that that is the genesis of what we're facing. So I think what we need to do, and that's one of the reasons that we, especially as environmental advocates, need to address this economic problem head on, is because it's very easy to be led down this path of, we need to do these other types of activities in order to better internalize the cost of the economic system. Well, we'll never be able to do that. We can do that somewhat, and we should. We should definitely do some of it, but to think that that's the solution is misguided. We need to address the economic system head on, and that's the real problem that we need to address. So on the political pushback question, you do get people who say, oh, well, that's interesting, or what are you thinking about this new water permit, and they just sort of flip back into the same, regular interactions that, we normally have. And I'm happy to weigh in and help and try to push the ball forward in the ways that I can. But I think that, I think that people are starting to listen. I mean, I do think there's been pushback, but you don't tend to talk to people who aren't willing at all to listen, because there's only so much time in a day, and you really only need to talk to people who might be interested in listening. I have a friend in the legislature who is a staffer who does water work, and a friend of mine told me, said to him, gosh, either I'm going crazy or she's starting to make some sense, So, it's something that's slowly starting to take hold among people who are interested in looking for potential solutions. And that's not to say, I have the answers or Rights of Nature has all the answers. Absolutely not. There's a lot of answers out there. But addressing, I think the core issue of addressing the problem in front of us, everybody agrees that we're not properly addressing the problem in front of us. Because if we were, we wouldn't be facing climate change and species extinctions and drying waterways and all of the other threats that we're facing to both in the environment and to human rights worldwide that we already know about. So people can agree there's a problem, we're not addressing it properly, we're trying a bunch of different things, and at some point maybe this will work. So people are starting to look for new solutions, and that's the reason that I put them out there, because I know the old ones aren't going to work by themselves.
I want to ask you a little bit about where you found allies or not found allies in the religious community. As a Christian, I was raised with a deep understanding of stewardship, of nothing in creation belonging to us, but all belonging to God. And I'm very curious to see whether you've found that or whether you've found any pushback or have had no relationship with the religious communities at all in terms of the implementation or even just the theological discussions about this.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've found a number of the folks that I work with are very, the religious community is a big part of their lives. And so a lot of the people who tend to work on rights of nature were very heavily influenced by the writings of Thomas Berry and Pierre Terre de Chardin, who were Catholic theologians and geologians. And they were very influential, but certainly not, sort of, this is what the rules are and you must follow me. But, these principles came out of the recognition, especially that Thomas Berry had, about the spirituality of the earth itself. And I think that, for myself, my own religious upbringing was in the Catholic tradition. And so I think that allowed me the space to sort of, not necessarily formally as you articulated, have this sense of stewardship, but have this more sense of belonging, and care and love. And I mean, I think that expression of care and love that you get out of a religious tradition can extend easily out to, and especially as children, I mean, we could certainly easily say as children that, we loved a certain tree or we loved a forest, and that was natural and accepted. But can we say that now as adults? It's difficult, especially in a work context. And why is that? I mean, that's important to examine that question. So for myself, the folks who were working with Thomas Berry tended to be more in the Catholic tradition. There are a number of Buddhist people that I've worked with since that also are very heavily interested in this work from their own perspective of connection with the larger universe, with your sense of your larger interconnections. We're all one type of understanding. And so I think that all religious traditions at their core have that essential understanding. I mean, that's where the golden rule is sort of, it runs across so many traditions. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And that, I think, includes the earth. We need to be able to think back to this question of obligation. What are we doing or not doing, that we would want the earth to be doing or not doing to us? I think that question, since it runs across all these religious traditions, is one that we need to keep asking ourselves every day when we wake up.
And have you been able to tactically find allies for on-the-ground organizing through religious communities in the past in California, or for any of your policy work? Or?
Yeah, I mean, the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee has been very active in lobbying in California. In the international level, there have been a number of faith-based groups that work very heavily at the UN level, especially on mining. There's a group on work on mining at the UN doing advocacy work that is Baha'i, Catholic, Mennonite, really just kind of across the spectrum, working together on mining issues, especially where you see violations of human rights and environmental rights, and we're working with them specifically on this. And as you know, throughout American history in particular, religious communities have been at the forefront of rights-based movements. So I think that the religious community has been important, in my experience, to this particular rights-based movement as well.
I want to ask you further about the various international governance bodies that have been involved a lot of legal theorists right now are talking about a changing landscape internationally with governance and saying that the tasks traditionally performed by governments are now being performed by various bodies such as intergovernmental organizations like UN bodies or NGOs or even market agents. And I'm wondering if the Rights of Nature framework has any way of dealing with that. Another way of looking at it, well, let me ask you that first, and I'll follow.
Well, I'll answer what I think is the question, but it will be an answer. Yeah. I think part of the problem, and I can speak from 20 years of doing environmental advocacy in California, part of the problem is that people, in the state government, regular people, we, and myself included in other areas of my life, we've lost sense of our responsibility for our own government. We have delegated a lot of the responsibility, and we say, oh, that government is not doing such and such, But really, it's all of our responsibility every day to be able to see how, not only how our own actions impact the natural world and each other, but how our government's actions. And if we don't like what they're doing, and if we're not educated about that, then I think that's a real problem. That's a lack of exercise of our obligation to the planet to be able to do that. So the fact that, you could say, the Constitution of Ecuador says, nature has rights, but, unless everybody, is saying the same thing, and a lot of people of Ecuador are, and unfortunately the government's not really listening, but unless everybody's sort of saying the same thing and trying to articulate a new way of living, then we are, again, just sort of outsourcing our responsibility to NGOs, outsourcing our responsibility to non-existent government entities that we think are supposed to do the job, but really, ultimately, it's our job. It's all of our jobs. And so we need to be able to get back that obligation, that sense of responsibility. We can't outsource our own obligations for taking care of the natural world. It's something we have to do every day.
So if human rights law draws a boundary between individuals and governments and says basically we're saying where a government cannot infringe on an individual's rights, that seems like it divides an individual from government in some ways in terms of their freedom. Would it be, I know that the full intent of the Rights of Nature framework is to help people understand that they are totally mutually interdependent with nature, which is the opposite of dividing humans from nature. But wouldn't setting up a Rights of Nature framework, if it's parallel to a human rights framework, wouldn't that be dividing with a boundary between humans and nature?
Well, I mean, the way I understand your question, I think, is I'll answer it anyway. Is this idea of positive rights and negative rights, right? So if you have fundamental human rights and you draw a line between the humans and the government, you say the government can't violate these. Right. You're basically saying the government can't throw me in jail without due cause, and you can't kill me unless I have a fair trial or whatever. The government can't affirmatively go and do things, so you have a protection from the government for that. Whereas, what some people think of as nature's rights are, they say, it's more like the government has to go pay money to restore ecosystems and species, and that it may be both the case. So I don't think it's inconsistent with human rights or rights of nature to say that the government can't infringe on your fundamental rights. I mean, you are separating the government, but in that way, you're saying I have a certain worldview, that I am part of the earth, that I have rights, the earth has rights, and if you're coming in and infringing on those rights, I'm going to say, no, that's my obligation to say no. So saying no is different from creating a separation. It's correcting an error in terms of how we're supposed to behave. And that's all Rights of Nature is doing, is trying to allow us to create a governance system, a system of law and economics that shows us how to behave. And at some point, we're going to get to the point where the government needs to, because individually it's hard to, if we're going to restore the California Bay Delta estuary, we're not all going to show up with a shovel and say, okay, let's go. You need a plan, you need a larger system, and that's where the government is helpful. But you need to build that individually yourself and say, let's figure out how to do that. But fundamentally, you have to say, if the government, is trying to build, for example, twin tunnels to, take water through the delta in amounts that is unsustainable in order to save us from ourselves, then I think that it's time for you to say no, that's the violation of waterways' right to flow, and we need to say no to that. So, I think that you can have a rights of nature framework and say no at the same time.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So I think we have time for about 1 to 2 quick questions. And one thing that I think we found really interesting was how, in pursuing the rights of nature paradigm, you're creating laws to shape norms. And in law school and other places, I suppose, we talk a lot about should norms shape laws or should laws shape norms? And I was curious how you see that relationship in the rights of nature context.
I think both are absolutely essential. And if you just look at, what we try to do, and it's all very new. What we try to do is look at other rights-based movements and see how they evolved and see how they were created. And if I could, throw out one book reference, there's a great book called Bury the Chains, which is the history of the abolitionist movement. Maybe some of you have read it, in England. They were called the very first grassroots movement. The first one to have buttons and artwork. And it was really interesting because they were trying to change the law, to change the norms, but they also had to get a certain amount, and we've seen this with rights-based movements in the States. You have to get a certain amount of people sort of on your side before you can start to shift the tide. And so they did that through grassroots movements. They did that through lobbying. Legislators are powerful people to get them to say the right things. They did that through artwork. They would draw pictures of slave ships to illustrate to people, gosh, look at what this looks like. You have no idea how horrible this is, how immoral this is. And they were successful in changing the law, which then, people said, oh gosh, we can't do that. But once the laws change, it starts to bring around other people. The same thing with gay marriage. You had to start to do the education, the awareness, even television helped in that regard to make this, the understanding, the norms change so that you can change the law. And I'm very hopeful the Supreme Court's going to do the right thing. So you start to see that you really need to be doing both. And the same is true with rights of nature. I come at it from more of a legal perspective because I'm a lawyer, and a policy perspective because I'm a policy analyst. But there are people that do artwork. There are people that are doing music. There are people that are doing all kinds of other ways to build awareness and build understanding. People doing religious studies and retreats. All of these things are incredibly important to start to change how people think and feel, and that part's really important. How they feel about the natural world and how they talk about it. Even just linguistics, this idea about language is incredibly important in terms of how we are able to address these problems. I was just talking earlier about how a friend of mine, Michael McGonigal, up at the University of Victoria, coined this term that I like, adjective-noun problem. And so when you think about the adjectives and the nouns that we use, sustainable development, green economy, natural resources, try to write a paper about the environment without using the word natural resources. All of these terms, natural capital, all these terms, the noun is the focus, right? So capital, development, resources, that's the economic system that is controlling how we think and how we do policy and how we do law. Green, natural, sustainable, all these other terms, they're the modifiers, they're the throwaways. And that's what the natural world is, really, is a throwaway in this larger economic construct. So what we need to do is we're trying to change the norms, but we also have to change how we talk about it to start with. And I teach when I teach these classes, I downgrade people if they use the word natural resources because it's hard. It's hard to do, and every time you do it. Now, I hope you think how would I think about this differently? How would I say this word differently? And is that changing my construct of how I can create solutions? And everybody has something to offer to this. Everybody.
Yeah, that's great. So thinking about these students, and we have a room full of students here in the Divinity School and the Law School and the Forestry School. For folks who might be going into this field, do you have advice for how to utilize a rights of nature framework or how to join the battle to shift the paradigm?
I think my first advice would be, from my own perspective. You know, for me, you know, I was a California environmental advocate. I did pretty well. You know, I got some laws passed and was working with really great colleagues on some really great causes. But for me, I could not make that leap to rights of nature. Until I started having more of a spiritual awakening, until I started meditating, until I started, you know, reading more spiritual literature of the spirituality of the earth, until I started thinking about it in that way that is not just the intellectual, rational type of fashion that we do as lawyers and as policy analysts. You know, this is something I was used to and comfortable with. It was not the way that I was taught. I was an engineering undergrad. Until I started thinking about the earth as something else, it's something had its own spirituality that I was intimately connected with. I could not make that leap. And so I would say to people, you know, first, you know, just put aside all the intellectual stuff and just go for a hike, you know, go sit in a tree, you know, meditate, do whatever it is, try to do it outside, try to connect back with the natural world and try to reconnect with this feeling that I'm sure we all had, you know, as children about your connection with the earth. And I'll just, if this is the last question, I'll just end with a quick story. I had to do a talk at the California Environmental Law Association's, to the California ABA Environmental Group's annual meeting at Yosemite a few years ago. And Richard Love, Last Child in the Woods, was there speaking, and we all got a copy of his book, and that was really nice. And he said to all the lawyers, which were mostly compliance attorneys in private practice and in law firms, but, you know, trying to do the right thing, which was good, and enjoying the conference. And he said, everybody, don't need to say it right now, but go talk to people over the rest of the conference. Think about, you know, when you were a child, what was your connection with nature? What was your special connection with nature? And I've been to a lot of law conferences, you know, but never like this, where, like, seriously, for the next 2 or 3 days, I would hear strangers coming up over the coffee pots and saying, so, you know, what was yours, you know, because mine was fishing in this one creek with my dad, and I remember this one fall day, and the leaves were really pretty, and people felt like they were open enough because they'd been given that permission to talk about their relationship with nature in that way. And until you sort of open yourself up to that possibility, it's going to be really hard to do this kind of work. And I'd say just give yourself permission to go out and love the earth, and then you can bring that back to your work.
On behalf of Yale Divinity School, Forestry School, and the Law School, just want to thank you again for being with us today, and thank all the viewers for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.